Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight we are going to talk about the Trojan War, a tale of pride, beauty, and sorrow carried on the winds of myth and memory. Close your eyes and let your mind drift back through the mists of time to an age when gods walked among mortals and heroes cast shadows as long as mountain peaks. Tonight, we journey to the shores of the Aegean, where bronze spears caught the light of dying suns, and the walls of Troy stood proud against the endless siege of time itself. This is a story that has echoed through 3,000 years, whispered from grandmother to grandchild, sung by wandering bards, and carved into the very stones of our collective memory. The Trojan War was not merely a conflict between armies. It was a tapestry woven from the threads of divine jealousy, mortal ambition, and the eternal human struggle between love and duty. As we drift through this ancient tale, let the rhythm of waves against weathered hulls and the distant clang of bronze on bronze carry you into a deeper understanding of our shared past, where myth and history dance together, like firelight on water. In the beginning, as with so many tales of woe, there was a wedding. Picture, if you will, a gathering unlike any the world had ever seen. On the slopes of Mount Pelion, where wild flowers carpeted the earth in colors that seemed to have been painted by the gods themselves, the sea nymph Thetis was to be wed to Peleus, a mortal king whose courage had won him the heart of a goddess. The very air seemed to shimmer with divine presence as the immortals descended from their celestial realm to witness this union between the world of gods and the world of men. Zeus himself, king of the gods, had decreed this marriage, though not without reservation. The fates had whispered to him of a prophecy, that any son born to Thetis would grow to be greater than his father. And so, to prevent a child who might one day challenge his throne, Zeus had arranged for the beautiful sea nymph to marry a mortal, ensuring that her offspring would be bound by the limitations of human flesh, even as divine blood flowed through his veins. The wedding feast was a spectacle of impossible beauty. Nectar flowed like golden rivers, and ambrosia was served on plates of silver and gold. The muses sang songs so lovely that the very mountains seemed to lean in to listen. Flowers bloomed and bloomed again in endless cycles, as if time itself was celebrating. The sea, usually restless and wild, lay calm and still, reflecting the stars like a mirror made of sapphires. But even in paradise, discord finds a way to take root. Eris, the goddess of strife and discord, had not been invited to this celebration. Some say it was an oversight, others that it was deliberate, for what joy could be found in the presence of one whose very nature was to sow chaos? But Eris was not one to be ignored, and her wounded pride would shape the fate of empires. As the wedding guests laughed and celebrated, sharing stories and wine beneath the starlit sky, a golden apple rolled into their midst. It was beautiful beyond description, its surface catching the light of the torches and throwing it back in dancing patterns that seemed almost alive. Upon the apple, carved in letters that seemed to burn with their own inner fire, were 3 simple words: "To the fairest." The conversation fell silent as the divine guests gazed upon this unexpected gift. 3 goddesses, each possessed of beauty beyond mortal comprehension, each felt the pull of those fateful words. Hera, queen of the gods, whose very presence commanded reverence and whose beauty was as regal as the dawn breaking over snow-capped peaks. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, whose grey eyes held the depth of ages and whose fierce beauty was like that of a storm-tossed sea. And Aphrodite, goddess of love, whose beauty was so perfect it could stop the heart, and whose smile could launch 1,000 ships. Each goddess reached for the apple, and in that moment the seeds of Troy's destruction were sown. For among the gods, as among mortals, vanity and pride can eclipse wisdom. The three goddesses turned to Zeus, expecting him to judge between them, but the king of the gods was too wise to be drawn into such a trap. He knew that whichever goddess he chose, the other two would become his enemies, and the balance of Olympus would be shattered. Instead, Zeus cast his eyes over the assembled guests and smiled, though there was sadness in his expression, as if he could already see the tragedy that would unfold. He gestured toward the mortal realm, where on the slopes of Mount Ida a young shepherd tended his flocks. "Let Paris, son of Priam, decide," Zeus declared. "He is young and handsome, and his eyes are not clouded by the politics of gods. Let him choose the fairest." Paris, prince of Troy, had been abandoned as a baby when prophecy foretold that he would bring destruction to his city. But fate is not so easily thwarted, and the child had been found and raised by shepherds, growing into a young man of surpassing beauty and gentle nature. He lived a simple life among the hills, caring for his flocks and playing his lyre beneath the olive trees, unaware of his royal birth or the doom that shadowed his future. The three goddesses descended to the mortal realm like falling stars, their divine radiance dimmed just enough that Paris might look upon them without being struck blind. They found him in a grove where the afternoon light filtered through leaves like liquid gold, and the air was sweet with the scent of wild flowers and honey. As Paris looked upon the three goddesses, each more beautiful than anything he had ever imagined, he felt the weight of an impossible choice settling upon his shoulders. How could a mortal man judge between such perfect beauty? How could he choose without offending the others? But the goddesses were not content to let their beauty speak for itself. Each offered him a bribe that would tempt the heart of any mortal man. Hera, with her queenly bearing and voice like distant thunder, promised him power beyond imagining. "Choose me," she said, "and I will make you ruler of all Asia. Kingdoms will bow before you, and your name will be remembered forever as the greatest of kings." Athena, her grey eyes flashing with intelligence and strength, offered him wisdom and glory in battle. "Choose me," she said, "and I will make you the wisest of men and the greatest warrior who ever lived. You will be invincible in battle, and your victories will be sung for all time." But it was Aphrodite who spoke to the deepest longing of his heart. The goddess of love stepped forward, her beauty like the dawn of the world, and her voice was like honey mixed with wine. "Choose me," she whispered, "and I will give you the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Helen of Sparta, whose beauty surpasses that of any mortal, will be yours." Paris, young and perhaps foolish, but driven by the same desires that move all human hearts, did not hesitate. He took the golden apple and placed it in Aphrodite's hands. "You are the fairest," he said, sealing not only his own fate, but the fate of Troy itself. Aphrodite smiled, but it was a smile that held both promise and menace. She would keep her bargain, but the price would be higher than anyone could imagine. Hera and Athena departed in silence, their beautiful faces masks of fury, and from that day forward they would be enemies of Troy and all who dwelt within its walls. The object of Aphrodite's promise lived far to the south, in the palace of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Helen was her name, and she was indeed the most beautiful woman in the world. Her beauty was of the kind that poets struggle to describe, not merely physical perfection, but something that seemed to emanate from within, a radiance that made all who looked upon her feel as if they were glimpsing something divine. Helen had been born from the union of Zeus and Leda, queen of Sparta, and divine blood flowed in her veins. Her beauty had been apparent from childhood, and by the time she reached marriageable age, suitors had come from every corner of the Greek world to seek her hand. Kings and princes, warriors and nobles, all had traveled to Sparta in hopes of winning her love. The situation had grown so tense that war seemed inevitable. Each suitor believed he had the strongest claim, and their followers were gathering armies, preparing to settle the matter with bronze and blood. But Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, had proposed a solution that would preserve peace while ensuring Helen's protection. All the suitors, he suggested, should swear an oath to protect Helen and her chosen husband, whoever he might be. If any man should ever attempt to steal her away or harm her, all the others would unite to bring him to justice. This was the oath of Tyndareus, named for Helen's mortal father, and it was sealed with sacrifices and prayers to the gods. Helen chose Menelaus, the brother of mighty Agamemnon, and their wedding was celebrated throughout the Greek world. For several years they lived in happiness in Sparta, blessed with a daughter named Hermione. Helen was content, or so it seemed, ruling beside her husband with grace and wisdom, her beauty undimmed by the passage of time. But Aphrodite had not forgotten her promise to Paris. The goddess of love began to weave her spell, drawing the young prince of Troy away from his shepherd's life and back to the palace where he had been born. King Priam, his father, welcomed him with joy, for despite the dark prophecy that had caused his abandonment, parental love had triumphed over fear. Paris was received at court with all the honors due to a prince of Troy. He was dressed in fine robes, given a place at his father's right hand, and gradually introduced to the responsibilities of royalty. But Aphrodite's influence was already working upon him, filling his dreams with visions of Helen's beauty and whispers of destiny. The goddess arranged for Paris to be sent as an ambassador to Sparta, ostensibly to negotiate trade agreements between the two kingdoms. It was a mission that would serve both diplomatic and personal purposes, for it would give Paris the opportunity to see Helen with his own eyes, and, if Aphrodite's plans came to fruition, to claim the prize that had been promised to him. The journey from Troy to Sparta took many days, and Paris traveled with a small but richly appointed retinue. His ships were laden with gifts, gold and silver, fine textiles, and precious stones that gleamed like captured starlight. As they sailed across the wine-dark sea, Paris felt his heart racing with anticipation and fear. He had heard tales of Helen's beauty, but could any mortal woman truly be as lovely as the goddess had promised? When Paris arrived in Sparta, he was received with all the courtesy due to a visiting prince. Menelaus welcomed him into his palace, following the ancient laws of hospitality that governed relations between nobles. The great hall was filled with the scent of roasted meat and wine, and the walls were hung with tapestries that told the stories of heroes and gods. But when Helen entered the hall, Paris felt his breath catch in his throat. She was more beautiful than he had dared imagine, more perfect than Aphrodite herself had described. Her hair was like spun gold, her eyes the color of the sea on a summer morning, and her smile was like the dawn breaking over mountains. She moved with a grace that seemed almost divine, and when she spoke, her voice was like music. Helen, for her part, felt an immediate and overwhelming attraction to the handsome prince from Troy. This was Aphrodite's magic at work, but it felt as natural as breathing. She found herself drawn to his gentle manner, his musical voice, and the sadness she glimpsed in his eyes. There was something about him that seemed to call to her very soul, a connection that transcended the boundaries of propriety and duty. For 10 days, Paris remained in Sparta as Menelaus's guest. Each day, he and Helen found reasons to spend time together. They walked in the palace gardens, where roses bloomed in impossible profusion, and fountains sang with crystal voices. They spoke of poetry and music, of the beauty of the natural world and the mysteries of the gods. With each passing hour, their attraction grew stronger, fed by Aphrodite's influence and their own willing hearts. On the final night of his visit, as the palace slept and the moon cast silver shadows through the windows, Paris came to Helen's chambers. They spoke in whispers, their voices urgent with the knowledge that this might be their only chance. Helen faced an impossible choice: remain with her husband and fulfill her duties as Queen of Sparta, or flee with Paris and follow the dictates of her heart. Love, or perhaps the goddess who ruled over it, triumphed over duty. As dawn broke over the Spartan hills, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Helen and Paris fled together, taking with them a small retinue of loyal servants and a treasure chest filled with gold and precious stones. They sailed away from Sparta like thieves in the night, leaving behind a husband, a daughter, and a kingdom that would never be the same. When Menelaus awoke to find his wife gone, his rage shook the very foundations of his palace. He had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. His wife had been stolen, his hospitality violated, and his honor trampled in the dust. But more than personal hurt, this was a violation of the sacred laws that governed civilized society. The oath that had been sworn by all of Helen's former suitors was now called into effect. Menelaus sent messengers racing across Greece, calling upon every king and prince who had sworn the oath of Tyndareus to honor their word. The message was simple, but loaded with the weight of destiny. Helen had been taken by a Trojan prince, and all who had sworn to protect her must now unite to bring her home. The response was swift and decisive. From every corner of the Greek world, armies began to gather. Ships were fitted with bronze rams and loaded with weapons and provisions. The greatest heroes of the age heard the call and prepared for war. The wheels of fate, set in motion by a golden apple and a shepherd's choice, were now turning with inexorable force towards the walls of Troy. But even as the armies gathered, some among the heroes were reluctant to leave their homes and families for what might prove to be a long and costly war. Two figures in particular would require special persuasion to join the cause: Odysseus of Ithaca and Achilles, son of Thetis. Agamemnon, the brother of wronged Menelaus and the most powerful king in Greece, knew that his success would depend upon gathering the greatest possible force. He would need not only numbers, but also the exceptional skills of the greatest warriors and the wisest commanders. The expedition to Troy would require every advantage that the Greeks could muster. The call to arms echoed across the Greek world like thunder rolling across a summer sky. From the mountains of Thessaly to the islands of the Aegean, from the olive groves of Attica to the wheat fields of Boeotia, kings and princes began the great gathering. This was to be no ordinary war, but a conflict that would test the very foundations of heroic society. Agamemnon had assumed the role of commander-in-chief, not merely because of his relationship to the wronged Menelaus, but because he possessed the largest kingdom and the most powerful fleet. His city of Mycenae, with its massive walls built from stones so large that men would later say they had been placed there by giants, was the heart of a network of alliances that stretched across the Greek world. The king of Mycenae was a man of imposing presence and iron will. His beard was touched with silver, his eyes were the color of storm clouds, and his voice could silence a room full of arguing warriors. He carried himself with the authority of one who had never known defeat, who had conquered cities and commanded the loyalty of lesser kings through a combination of strength, cunning, and ruthless determination. From his palace, Agamemnon sent out the call to every kingdom that owed him allegiance or had sworn the oath to protect Helen. The response was swift and overwhelming. Diomedes came from Argos, bringing with him squadrons of chariots and companies of spearmen trained from childhood in the arts of war. Nestor, the aged but still formidable king of Pylos, brought not only his own forces, but also the wisdom of long experience and the respect of all who knew him. The two Ajax came from their respective kingdoms. Ajax the Great from Salamis, a man of towering height and unmatched strength, who could wield a spear like a tree branch and whose shield was large enough to cover 3 ordinary men. Ajax the Lesser from Locris was smaller in stature, but swift as a deer and deadly with his spear, commanding a fleet of 40 ships filled with warriors eager for glory. But it was clear to Agamemnon that the success of the expedition would depend upon securing the participation of 2 particular heroes, each of whom presented unique challenges. The first was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, whose reputation for cleverness and strategic thinking was matched only by his well-known love of home and family. Odysseus had recently married Penelope, a woman whose beauty was matched by her intelligence and virtue. Their son, Telemachus, was still an infant, and the king of Ithaca was reluctant to leave his young family for what might prove to be a long and dangerous campaign. When Agamemnon's messenger arrived at his palace, Odysseus was found playing with his baby son on the beach, teaching him to recognize the calls of different seabirds and the patterns of waves on the shore. The messenger delivered Agamemnon's summons with all the gravity the situation demanded. He spoke of honor and duty, of the oath that had been sworn, and the insult that had been offered to all of Greece. He painted vivid pictures of the glory that awaited those who participated in the expedition and the shame that would fall upon those who stayed home. But Odysseus was not easily swayed by appeals to glory or threats of shame. He had seen enough of war to know its true cost, and he had too much to lose. His kingdom was prosperous and well-governed. His wife was the joy of his heart, and his son represented the future of his dynasty. Why should he risk all of this for the sake of another man's wife, no matter how beautiful she might be? Yet Odysseus was too clever to simply refuse the summons outright. Such a refusal would mark him as a coward and an oath-breaker, and would invite the wrath of not only Agamemnon, but all the kings of Greece. Instead, he devised a plan that would demonstrate his madness and thus excuse him from military service. When Agamemnon's envoys arrived at his palace for the second time, demanding a definitive answer to the summons, they found Odysseus engaged in apparently mad behavior. He had yoked a horse and an ox together to his plough, and was attempting to furrow his fields with this mismatched team, all while sowing salt instead of seed. He appeared to be completely lost in his own world, muttering incoherently and showing no recognition of the distinguished visitors. The envoys were initially taken aback by this display, but one among them, Palamedes, was nearly as clever as Odysseus himself. He suspected that the king's madness was merely a ruse, and he devised a test that would reveal the truth. Taking the infant Telemachus from his nurse, Palamedes placed the child directly in the path of Odysseus's plough. The test worked perfectly. Despite his apparent madness, Odysseus immediately stopped his ploughing and swept his son to safety, his face showing all the love and concern of a devoted father. The pretense was shattered, and Odysseus stood revealed as perfectly sane. He had no choice but to acknowledge his oath and agree to join the expedition. But even as he accepted his fate, Odysseus knew that he would not forget Palamedes' role in exposing his deception. The king of Ithaca had a long memory and a talent for patient revenge. He would bide his time and wait for the proper moment to repay the debt. The second crucial recruitment proved even more challenging. Achilles, son of the sea goddess Thetis and the mortal king Peleus, was widely acknowledged to be the greatest warrior of his generation. His strength was legendary, his speed was unmatched, and his skill with spear and sword was such that older warriors would stop their own training to watch him practice. But Thetis, with a mother's love and a goddess's foresight, had received a prophecy that filled her divine heart with dread. Her son would face a choice when he reached manhood. He could live a long and peaceful life in obscurity, or he could win immortal glory through a heroic death in battle. The prophecy was specific about the location of this glorious death. It would come beneath the walls of Troy. Determined to save her son from this fate, Thetis had hidden Achilles away on the island of Skyros in the court of King Lycomedes. But she had not merely hidden him. She had disguised him as a young woman, dressing him in feminine clothing and teaching him to move and speak like a girl. The deception was aided by Achilles' own natural beauty. He was young enough and fair enough to pass as a maiden, especially among strangers. The young hero chafed at this disguise, but his love for his mother and his understanding of her fears kept him from rebelling against it. He spent his days among the daughters of Lycomedes, learning to weave and sing, to dance and play the lyre. In many ways, it was a pleasant existence, but it could not entirely suppress the warrior's spirit that burned within him. As time passed, Achilles grew close to one of the king's daughters, Deidamia. What had begun as companionship deepened into love, and eventually into an intimate relationship that produced a son, Neoptolemus. This gave Achilles another reason to remain in hiding. He was now not only a son, but a father, with responsibilities that went beyond his own desires for glory. When Agamemnon learned that Achilles was not to be found in his father's kingdom, he dispatched Odysseus and Diomedes to search for the missing hero. The two kings scoured the islands of the Aegean, following rumors and investigating any story that might lead them to their quarry. Eventually, their search led them to Skyros, where they began to suspect that one of King Lycomedes' daughters might not be what she seemed. Odysseus, ever the master of deception, devised a plan to reveal Achilles' true identity. He arrived at the palace of Lycomedes, disguised as a merchant, carrying with him a selection of goods that would appeal to young women: fine silks and jewelry, cosmetics and perfumes, all displayed in an attractive manner. But hidden among these feminine luxuries, he had placed a sword and a spear of exceptional quality. The daughters of Lycomedes, including the disguised Achilles, were invited to examine the merchant's wares. The young women flocked to the silks and jewels, exclaiming over their beauty and holding them up to the light. But one figure moved differently, drawn inexorably to the weapons. Despite his feminine disguise, Achilles could not resist the pull of the beautifully crafted sword, and he lifted it with the natural grace of a born warrior. At that moment, Odysseus gave a prearranged signal, and Diomedes, who had been waiting outside, sounded a trumpet call that mimicked the sound of an army approaching. The young women screamed and fled, but Achilles' reaction was entirely different. He stripped off his feminine disguise, grasped the sword and spear, and prepared to meet the supposed attackers with the fierce joy of a warrior finally allowed to be himself. The deception was revealed, and Achilles stood before them in his true form, tall and golden-haired, with the easy grace of a natural athlete and the bright eyes of a hero. He was perhaps the most beautiful young man any of them had ever seen, and his beauty was made more striking by the obvious strength and courage that radiated from him. But even as Odysseus congratulated himself on his cleverness, he could see the conflict in Achilles' eyes. The young hero was torn between his desire for glory and his love for his family. He looked back toward the palace, where Deidamia and their infant son waited, and for a moment it seemed as if he might refuse the call. It was then that Odysseus played his final card. He spoke not of duty or honor, but of the glory that awaited at Troy. He painted pictures of epic battles and heroic deeds, of songs that would be sung for 1,000 years, and fame, that would make Achilles' name immortal. He spoke of the great heroes who would fight beside him and the mighty enemies he would face. But most importantly, he spoke of Hector, the greatest warrior of Troy, whose reputation for courage and skill was known throughout the world. "Here is an enemy worthy of you," Odysseus said, his voice low and compelling. "Here is a man against whom you can test your strength and prove your worth. What glory is there in living quietly on a peaceful island when such challenges await?" Achilles felt the warrior's blood singing in his veins, calling him to the destiny that the gods had prepared for him. He thought of his mother's warnings, of the prophecy that promised him a choice between long life and glorious death. But he was young, and the prospect of immortal fame burned brighter in his imagination than the distant threat of mortality. "I will come," he said, his voice carrying the ring of destiny. "I will go to Troy and win the glory that the gods have promised me." Thetis, watching from her palace beneath the waves, felt her heart break as she saw her son make his choice. She had done everything in her power to save him, but she could not fight against his own nature or the will of the fates. She could only love him and try to protect him as much as divine law would allow. With Achilles and Odysseus committed to the cause, the gathering of the Greek forces could begin in earnest. The designated meeting place was the port of Aulis, a natural harbor on the coast of Boeotia that could accommodate the largest fleet that had ever been assembled. Ships began arriving from every corner of the Greek world, their bronze rams glinting in the sunlight and their painted eyes staring out over the wine-dark sea. The sight was magnificent and terrible at the same time. Nearly 1,000 ships filled the harbor, their masts creating a forest of wood and rope that stretched as far as the eye could see. The beaches were covered with tents and pavilions, each marked with the banners and emblems of different kingdoms. The air was filled with the sound of hammers on metal as weapons were sharpened and armor was repaired, the neighing of horses and the lowing of cattle, the voices of men preparing for war. But for all the impressive preparations, the fleet faced a problem that no amount of bronze or courage could solve. The winds that should have carried them across the Aegean to Troy had died away completely, leaving the sea as smooth as a mirror and the ships stranded in the harbor. Day after day, the warriors waited, watching the horizon for any sign of the breeze that would allow them to begin their journey. The prophet Calchas, who had been brought along to interpret the will of the gods, delivered a reading that chilled the hearts of all who heard it. The goddess Artemis, he declared, was angry with Agamemnon for a boast he had made about his skill as a hunter. The king had claimed that he could shoot better than the goddess herself, and this hubris had earned her wrath. The price of Artemis's forgiveness was higher than anyone had imagined. She demanded the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, the most beautiful and beloved of his children. Only her death would appease the goddess's anger and allow the winds to return. The demand threw the entire expedition into crisis. Agamemnon was a hard man, accustomed to making difficult decisions, but this was beyond anything he had ever faced. To sacrifice his own daughter for the sake of a war, even a war that involved the honor of all Greece, seemed a price too high to pay. The king walked alone on the beach that night, staring out at the motionless sea and wrestling with the most terrible choice of his life. He thought of Iphigenia, her laughter ringing through the halls of his palace, her gentle hands placing flowers in his hair, her trusting eyes looking up at him with absolute love. How could he order her death? How could he live with himself if he did? But around him, the greatest army in the world's history was growing restless. The men had left their homes and families, their farms and flocks, to follow him to war. If he failed to lead them, if he allowed the expedition to collapse over his personal feelings, he would be branded as a coward and a failure. The honor of Greece itself was at stake. The other kings watched Agamemnon struggle with a mixture of sympathy and impatience. They understood his pain, but they also knew that leadership sometimes required the hardest choices. Odysseus, Menelaus, and the others pressed him to make the sacrifice, arguing that the needs of the many outweighed the life of one, even one so precious. In the end, it was Agamemnon's sense of duty that triumphed over his love as a father. He sent word to his wife, Clytemnestra, telling her to bring Iphigenia to Aulis on the pretext that she was to be married to Achilles. The lie was cruel but necessary. If the queen knew the truth, she would never allow her daughter to leave Mycenae. When Iphigenia arrived at the camp, radiant with joy at the prospect of her wedding, the sight of her nearly broke her father's resolve. She was everything he remembered, and more: beautiful, innocent, trusting, and so full of life that it seemed impossible that death could touch her. She ran to embrace him, laughing with happiness, and Agamemnon had to use all his strength to keep from weeping. The truth could not be hidden for long. When Iphigenia learned of her fate, her joy turned to terror and disbelief. She begged her father to spare her, throwing herself at his feet and reminding him of all the happy times they had shared. She spoke of the life she had hoped to live, the children she had dreamed of bearing, the future that was being torn away from her. But perhaps the most heartbreaking moment came when Iphigenia's initial terror gave way to acceptance. She saw the agony in her father's eyes, the way his hands shook as he held her, and she understood that this was not a choice, but a necessity. If her death could save the expedition and preserve the honor of Greece, then she would face it with courage. "I will die for Greece," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "If the gods demand my life, I will give it willingly. Let my death have meaning. Let it serve a purpose greater than myself." The sacrifice was carried out at dawn on an altar built on the beach where the waves lapped gently against the shore. Iphigenia walked to her fate with dignity, her head held high, her voice raised in a hymn to the gods. At the moment of her death, some witnesses swore they saw a deer appear on the altar in her place, and that Artemis herself had spirited the girl away to serve as her priestess. But others saw only the terrible reality of a father's love sacrificed on the altar of duty. As Iphigenia's blood soaked into the sand, the winds began to stir. At first, it was only a gentle breeze that ruffled the surface of the water, but it quickly grew stronger until the sails of the ships began to fill and strain against their moorings. The goddess had been appeased, and the way to Troy was open. But the price of that wind would haunt the expedition from its very beginning. Clytemnestra, learning of her daughter's fate, swore a terrible oath of vengeance against her husband. The seeds of tragedy had been planted in the very heart of the Greek royal family, and they would bear bitter fruit in years to come. As the great fleet prepared to depart, Agamemnon stood on the deck of his flagship, watching the coastline of Greece fade into the distance. The wind filled his sails and carried him toward his destiny, but he could not escape the memory of his daughter's face, or the knowledge that his victory, if it came, would be built on the foundation of her death. The voyage across the wine-dark sea was like a dream painted in shades of blue and gold. Nearly 1,000 ships moved in formation across the Aegean, their bronze prows cutting through the waves with steady rhythm, their painted eyes staring fixedly toward the east, where Troy awaited. The sight was one of such magnificent beauty that even the hardened warriors aboard the ships paused in their preparations to marvel at the spectacle they were part of. The ships themselves were works of art, as much as instruments of war. Each vessel was painted in the colors of its kingdom, the deep blue and gold of Mycenae, the sea green of Ithaca, the rich purple of Pylos. Their sails billowed with the wind that Artemis had finally granted, and their bronze-sheathed rams gleamed in the sunlight like the teeth of some great sea monster. The sound of their passage was like a song, the whisper of wind through rigging, the creak of timber, the splash of oars keeping time. Aboard the ships, the warriors settled into the rhythm of a sea voyage that might last for days or weeks, depending on the winds and the will of the gods. There was time for conversation, for the sharing of stories and songs, for the quiet contemplation that comes with staring out over an endless expanse of water. Veterans of previous campaigns spoke of battles they had fought and enemies they had faced, while younger men listened with the eager attention of those who hoped to win their own share of glory. The sea itself seemed to welcome the great fleet. Dolphins raced alongside the ships, their sleek bodies cutting through the waves with effortless grace. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries adding to the symphony of wind and water. Flying fish burst from the foam like living jewels, catching the sunlight on their scales before disappearing back into the depths. The water was so clear that men could see down to the sandy bottom, where fish swam in schools that looked like moving clouds. But it was not merely the beauty of the voyage that made it memorable. There was something almost sacred about this journey, a sense that they were participating in events that would echo through history. The men aboard the ships were not just warriors sailing to battle. They were heroes setting out on a quest that would define the very meaning of heroism for generations to come. As the days passed, the fleet made its way past islands that rose from the sea like the backs of sleeping giants. Some were lush and green, covered with olive groves and vineyards that painted the hillsides in silver and gold. Others were stark and rocky, their cliffs rising straight from the water like the walls of some Titan's fortress. Each island had its own character, its own stories, its own gods and spirits that watched the passage of the great fleet with ancient, knowing eyes. The ships would put in at sheltered harbours for fresh water and supplies, and the local inhabitants would come down to the beaches to stare in wonder at the greatest assembly of heroes the world had ever seen. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts, peering out with wide eyes at these legendary figures they had heard about in songs and stories. Old men nodded knowingly, remembering other expeditions, other wars, and understanding that they were witnessing history in the making. There were occasional skirmishes and adventures along the way. Some islands were ruled by kings who were hostile to the Greek cause, and these had to be subdued by force. Other harbours were controlled by pirates who saw the rich fleet as a target too tempting to resist. But these conflicts were brief and decisive, serving mainly to give the younger warriors their first taste of battle, and to remind everyone that they were no longer in the peaceful world they had left behind. As the fleet drew closer to the coast of Troy, the mood aboard the ships began to change. The easy camaraderie of the voyage gave way to a more serious and focused attitude. Weapons were checked and rechecked, armor was polished until it gleamed, and strategies were discussed and debated. The men knew that they were approaching the most formidable city in the world, protected by walls that had never been breached and defended by warriors whose courage was legendary. The first sight of the Trojan coast was both thrilling and sobering. The city itself was still hidden beyond the horizon, but the land that appeared before them was beautiful and fertile, with rolling hills covered in grain and olive groves that spoke of prosperity and careful cultivation. This was not some barbarous frontier, but a rich and sophisticated civilization that would not yield easily to conquest. When Troy itself finally came into view, rising from the plain like a vision from the realm of the gods, even the most battle-hardened veterans fell silent. The walls were higher and stronger than anything they had imagined, built from massive stones, fitted together with such precision that a knife blade could not be inserted between them. The towers rose like fingers pointing toward heaven, and from the highest rampart flew the banner of Priam, king of Troy, a golden eagle on a field of purple. But it was not just the physical strength of the city that impressed the Greeks. There was something about Troy that spoke of age and dignity, of a culture that had flourished for centuries and had no intention of yielding to foreign invaders. The very stones seemed to radiate defiance, and the morning sun reflecting off the bronze gates and marble columns created an effect so dazzling that some men had to shield their eyes. The landing was not unopposed. Trojan forces had been watching the approach of the Greek fleet from the moment it appeared on the horizon, and they were ready with a defense that was both fierce and well organized. Arrows whistled through the air as the first boats ground against the beach, and Trojan chariots thundered across the sand, their bronze wheels throwing up clouds of dust that glittered in the morning light. But the Greeks had not come so far to be turned back by the first resistance they encountered. Achilles was among the first to leap from his ship, his spear already in his hand, and his war cry echoing across the beach like the roar of a lion. Where he landed, the Trojans fell back, unable to stand against the fury of his assault. Behind him came the other heroes. Ajax with his massive shield, Diomedes with his deadly spear, Odysseus with his sharp sword and sharper mind. The battle for the beach was brief, but intense. The Trojans fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland, while the Greeks fought with the eagerness of warriors finally given the chance to prove themselves. Bronze clashed against bronze, horses screamed and reared, and the sand grew dark with blood. But superior numbers and the element of surprise gave the advantage to the Greeks, and by midday they had secured a foothold on Trojan soil. The first phase of the war had begun, but it would not be the last. As the Greeks established their camp on the beach and began the work of unloading their ships, they could see the walls of Troy in the distance, seemingly as impregnable as ever. This would not be a war that would be won in a single battle or decided in a single season. The siege of Troy had begun, and it would test the endurance and determination of both sides in ways that none of them could yet imagine. The siege settled into a rhythm that would define the next 9 years of warfare. The Greeks established a sprawling camp on the beach, protected by a wall and ditch that stretched from sea to sea. Their ships were drawn up on the sand like sleeping sea beasts, their bronze prows pointing toward home, while their sterns faced the city they had come to conquer. Between the ships and the walls of Troy lay a broad plain that would become the stage for countless battles, a field where heroes would win glory and where the fate of 2 civilizations would be decided. Life in the camp took on its own character and customs. The warriors built huts and pavilions where they could take shelter from the wind and rain that swept in from the sea. Cookfires sent thin columns of smoke rising into the sky, and the smell of roasting meat and baking bread became a constant presence. There were areas set aside for training and exercise, where young warriors could practice their skills under the guidance of veterans, and others where the wounded could rest and recover from their injuries. The heroes each established their own domains within the larger camp. Agamemnon's pavilion was the largest and most magnificent, decorated with purple hangings and furnished with golden chairs and tables that spoke of his royal status. Achilles chose a spot near the water's edge, where he could hear the sound of waves and remember his divine mother. Odysseus built his shelter with characteristic cleverness, using materials salvaged from wrecked ships and positioning it for maximum protection from both weather and potential attack. As the months passed, the siege took on aspects of a strange kind of civilization. Traders began to arrive from neutral cities, bringing goods that the warriors needed: wine and olive oil, grain and honey, weapons and armor to replace those that had been damaged in battle. There were women, too, some of them captured in raids on Trojan allies, others who came voluntarily, drawn by the prospect of finding husbands among the greatest heroes of the age. The rhythm of warfare was punctuated by periods of relative calm, when both sides would tend to their wounded and repair their equipment. During these lulls, there was time for the pursuits that gave meaning to life beyond battle. Poets and musicians moved through the camp, composing songs about the deeds they had witnessed and the heroes they had come to know. Men wrote letters home, describing their adventures and assuring their families of their continued love and loyalty. But the war was never far away. From the walls of Troy, The defenders could see the smoke of the Greek campfires and hear the sound of their activities. At night, the glow of their fires painted the horizon like a false dawn, a constant reminder that an enemy army lay encamped on their shores. The Trojans, for their part, showed no signs of yielding. Their walls remained intact, their gates stayed closed, except when their own forces sallied forth to battle, and their defiance seemed as strong as ever. The plain between the two camps became a killing ground where small battles erupted with deadly regularity. Sometimes these were organized affairs, with both sides arraying their forces in formal battle lines and fighting according to the ancient codes of warfare. Other times they were spontaneous encounters between individual heroes, duels that would be remembered and sung about for generations. It was during one of these encounters that the Greeks first truly understood the caliber of enemy they faced. Hector, eldest son of King Priam and the greatest warrior of Troy, emerged from the city gates at the head of a company of chariots, their bronze wheels glinting in the morning sun, and their horses prancing with eagerness for battle. He was a man in the prime of life, tall and powerful, with the bearing of a natural leader and the confidence of one who had never known defeat. Hector's armor was a work of art as much as a tool of war. His breastplate was made of bronze, polished to mirror brightness, inlaid with silver and gold in patterns that told the story of his family's glory. His helmet was crowned with a plume of horsehair that danced in the wind, and his shield bore the image of a lion, the symbol of his courage and strength. But it was not his equipment that made him formidable. It was the nobility of his bearing and the obvious love his men bore for him. The Trojan prince did not fight with the savage fury of some warriors, nor with the cold calculation of others. Instead, he brought to battle a quality that was both inspiring and terrible, a sense of fighting for something greater than personal glory. He was defending his city, his family, his people, and this knowledge gave him a strength that went beyond mere physical prowess. When Hector challenged the greatest of the Greek warriors to single combat, there was a moment of silence in both armies. This was no ordinary challenge, but a test that would measure the relative strength of the two sides and perhaps influence the outcome of the entire war. The Greeks looked to their champions, waiting to see who would accept the challenge and face the greatest warrior of Troy. After a long moment, Ajax the Great stepped forward, his massive frame making him seem almost as tall as the walls of Troy themselves. The two warriors met in the space between the armies, their weapons gleaming into afternoon sun, and fought with a skill and courage that left both sides breathless with admiration. The battle raged until darkness fell, neither man able to gain a decisive advantage, and it ended with mutual respect and an exchange of gifts that honored the courage both had shown. But this duel was only a foretaste of the greater conflicts to come. As the siege continued, it became clear that Troy would not fall easily. The city's walls were indeed impregnable, and its warriors were every bit as skilled and determined as the Greeks had feared. The war that many had expected to last months was clearly going to stretch on for years, testing the resolve and resources of both sides in ways that no one had anticipated. Within the walls of Troy, life continued with a strange mixture of normalcy and tension. The city was large enough and rich enough to withstand a siege for many years, and its people had not yet felt the full weight of the war. Markets still operated, children still played in the streets, and the great festivals honoring the gods were still celebrated with traditional joy and solemnity. But the war cast its shadow over everything. Families lived with the constant fear that their sons and husbands might not return from the next battle. Women gathered on the walls to watch the fighting in the plain below, their hearts in their throats as they tried to pick out familiar figures among the bronze-clad warriors. The sound of battle, the clash of weapons, the cries of wounded men, the thunder of chariots became a constant background to daily life. King Priam, though advanced in years, remained a figure of dignity and strength who inspired confidence in his people. His hair had long since turned white, and his face bore the lines that come from years of responsibility and care. But his eyes remained bright, and his voice carried the authority of a man who had ruled wisely for decades. He spent long hours on the highest tower of his palace, looking out over the plain where his sons and subjects fought for the survival of their city. The royal family of Troy was large and closely knit, bound together by genuine affection as well as duty. Besides Hector, there were many other sons and daughters who played important roles in the defense of the city. Paris, despite his role in starting the war, had proven himself to be a capable archer and a brave fighter, though he would never match his brother's reputation for heroic leadership. Helen herself had become a figure of complex feelings within the city. Some blamed her for bringing disaster upon Troy, whispering that she should be returned to her husband to end the war. But others saw her as a victim of divine will, a woman whose beauty had made her a pawn in the games of gods, and whose suffering was as great as anyone's. She lived quietly in Paris's palace, trying to make herself useful and unobtrusive, haunted by the knowledge that thousands had died because of her. But it was Queen Hecuba, Priam's wife and the mother of Hector and Paris, who perhaps bore the greatest burden. She had to watch her sons ride out to battle each day, never knowing if they would return alive. She had to comfort the wives and mothers of other warriors, offering strength she did not always feel herself, and she had to maintain the dignity and composure expected of a queen, even as her heart broke a little more with each passing day. As the years of siege wore on, both sides began to feel the strain of prolonged warfare. The Greeks, far from home and dependent on supplies that had to be shipped across the Aegean, struggled with problems of logistics and morale. Some warriors began to question whether Helen was worth such a prolonged and costly war. Others grew homesick, thinking of the farms and families they had left behind, and wondering if they would ever see them again. The Trojans, while fighting on their home ground, faced their own difficulties. The constant state of siege meant that trade was disrupted, and resources became increasingly scarce. The walls that protected them also imprisoned them, cutting them off from the wider world and the allies who might have come to their aid. Young men who should have been learning trades and starting families instead spent their days learning the arts of war, and their nights standing guard on the walls. It was against this background of weariness and frustration that the events of the final year of the war began to unfold. The fragile alliances that held the Greek army together were beginning to show signs of strain, and it would take only a single incident to bring the simmering tensions to the surface. That incident came in the form of a quarrel between two proud men, a dispute that would shake the foundations of the Greek cause and nearly hand victory to Troy. The quarrel began, as so many disasters do, with something relatively minor. During a raid on a Trojan ally, the Greeks had captured a number of prisoners, including a young woman named Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo. She had been awarded to Agamemnon as part of his share of the spoils, but her father came to the Greek camp with a rich ransom, begging for her return. The priest, Chryseis, was a figure of dignity and pathos as he made his way through the Greek camp. His hair was white with age, his face was marked by years of devotion to his god, and he carried the sacred staff that marked his office. He prostrated himself before Agamemnon's pavilion and offered treasures that would have made a king wealthy: gold and silver, fine robes, and precious stones that caught the light like captured stars. But Agamemnon, perhaps influenced by pride, or perhaps simply unwilling to give up a prize he valued, refused the ransom and sent the old priest away with harsh words. He declared that Chryseis would remain his captive, and that her father should count himself fortunate to escape the camp with his life. It was a decision that would prove to be one of the most costly mistakes of the entire war. Apollo, the god of light and music, was also a deity of terrible wrath when his servants were mistreated. The old priest's prayers reached the god's ears, and Apollo's anger blazed like the sun at noon. The god descended to the Greek camp like a storm cloud, his silver bow in his hand, and his quiver full of arrows that brought not death in battle, but the slower, more terrible death of plague. The pestilence that struck the Greek camp was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Men who had survived countless battles succumbed to fever and weakness, their strength ebbing away like water poured into sand. The symptoms were terrible: burning fever, racking cough, and a thirst that no amount of water could quench. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried, and the smoke from funeral pyres created a pall that hung over the entire camp. For 9 days, the plague raged through the Greek forces, striking down common soldiers and heroes with equal indifference. Even Agamemnon, safe in his pavilion and surrounded by the best physicians in the army, could not escape the smell of death that permeated everything. The morale of the army, already strained by years of siege, began to crumble as men wondered if the gods themselves had turned against them. On the 10th day, Achilles called for an assembly of the army. The greatest of the Greek warriors stood before his comrades, his golden hair catching the light, and his voice carrying clearly across the gathering. He spoke with the authority of one whose courage was unquestioned and whose concern for his men was genuine. Something had to be done, he declared, or the army would be destroyed, not by Trojan spears, but by divine wrath. The prophet Calchas, called upon to interpret the meaning of the plague, trembled as he rose to speak. He knew that his words would anger the most powerful man in the army, but his duty to the gods and to truth compelled him to speak honestly. The plague, he announced, was Apollo's punishment for the treatment of Chryseis. Only by returning Chryseis to her father, with honors and without ransom, could the god's anger be appeased. Agamemnon's rage at this pronouncement was magnificent and terrible. His face turned red with fury, his hands clenched into fists, and his voice rose to a roar that could be heard throughout the camp. He accused Calchas of constantly bringing him bad news, of being a false prophet who delighted in predicting doom. But he could not deny the evidence of his own eyes. The plague was real, and something had to be done to stop it. With obvious reluctance, Agamemnon agreed to return Chryseis to her father. But his wounded pride demanded compensation, and he announced that he would take Briseis, Achilles' own prize, to replace the woman he was giving up. This demand struck at the very heart of the heroic code that governed the behavior of warriors. A man's prizes were not just property, but symbols of his honor and status. To take them away was to diminish him in the eyes of his peers. Achilles' response was swift and explosive. The young hero leaped to his feet, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt, and for a moment it seemed as if he might strike down the king of Mycenae, where he stood. His blue eyes blazed with fury, and his voice shook with rage as he denounced Agamemnon as a greedy coward who took the risks of war while claiming the lion's share of its rewards. "You shameless man!" Achilles cried, his words ringing across the assembly like the clash of bronze on bronze. "You, who wear the skin of a brave man, but have the heart of a deer. When have you ever armed yourself and gone into battle with your men? You prefer to skulk here in the camp, seizing the prizes of better men who actually do the fighting." The confrontation escalated rapidly, with both men trading insults that grew more personal and more bitter with each exchange. Agamemnon accused Achilles of being an arrogant boy who thought his divine parentage made him superior to his betters. Achilles responded by questioning Agamemnon's courage and leadership, suggesting that the army would be better off without him. The situation reached a crisis point when Achilles actually drew his sword, the bronze blade singing as it came free of its sheath. For a moment, it seemed as if he would end the quarrel by killing Agamemnon, regardless of the consequences. The assembled warriors held their breath, knowing that they were witnessing a moment that could change the course of history. But Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, intervened at the crucial moment. Invisible to all but Achilles, she appeared behind him and grasped his golden hair, her grey eyes flashing with divine authority. She commanded him to sheath his sword and trust in words rather than violence to settle the dispute. The goddess promised that the day would come when Agamemnon would regret his treatment of the greatest of the Greek warriors. Achilles, though his rage still burned like a fire in his chest, obeyed the goddess's command. He slammed his sword back into its sheath with a force that made the bronze ring like a bell. But his fury was far from spent. If Agamemnon wanted to take Briseis, he declared, then let him do so. But he would play no further part in this war. He would not fight for a king who treated him with such disrespect, and the Greeks could face Troy without his help. The threat was not an idle one. Achilles commanded 50 ships and nearly 2,000 warriors, including the legendary Myrmidons who had followed him from his father's kingdom. His personal prowess in battle was such that his presence on the field could turn the tide of any engagement. Without him, the Greek army would be significantly weakened, perhaps fatally so. But Agamemnon, his own pride now fully engaged, refused to back down. He ordered his heralds to go to Achilles' tent and take Briseis, regardless of the consequences. The scene that followed was one of the most poignant in the entire war. The young woman, who had come to love Achilles despite her status as a captive, was led away weeping, looking back over her shoulder at the man who had treated her with kindness and respect. Achilles watched her go with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. When the heralds had disappeared into the distance, he walked alone to the edge of the sea, where the waves lapped against the shore with their eternal rhythm. There he called upon his divine mother, pouring out his grief and anger in words that carried across the water like the cry of a wounded seabird. Thetis heard her son's call and rose from her palace beneath the waves like a pillar of silver mist. She found Achilles sitting on the beach, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of his emotions. The goddess took her son in her arms, as she had when he was a child, stroking his golden hair and listening to his tale of insult and betrayal. "My child," she said, her voice like the whisper of waves on shingle, "your life is destined to be brief but glorious. You should not have to endure such dishonor from lesser men." She promised to intercede with Zeus himself, to ask the king of the gods to grant victory to the Trojans until the Greeks realized how much they needed Achilles and begged for his return. Zeus, despite his sympathy for the Greek cause, was bound by his promise to Thetis. The goddess had once saved him from a rebellion by the other Olympians, and he owed her a debt that couldn't be ignored. With a heavy heart, he agreed to tip the balance of war in favor of Troy, at least temporarily. The consequences of this decision would be felt by both armies in the battles to come. True to his word, Achilles withdrew from all participation in the war. He spent his days in his tent, playing his lyre and singing songs of heroes who had lived in ages past. His men, the Myrmidons, remained loyal to him and also refused to fight, creating a significant gap in the Greek battle line. The black ships of Achilles sat silent on the beach, their bronze rams pointing toward home like accusing fingers. The effect of Achilles' withdrawal was felt almost immediately. In the first battle after the quarrel, the Trojans gained a significant victory, driving the Greeks back toward their ships and capturing ground that had been held for years. Hector led the Trojan charge with magnificent courage, his bronze spear flashing in the sunlight as he cut through the Greek ranks like a farmer reaping grain. Without Achilles to anchor their line, the Greeks found themselves at a severe disadvantage. Ajax and Diomedes fought with superhuman courage, and Odysseus used every stratagem he could devise. But they could not make up for the absence of their greatest warrior. Men who had stood firm for 9 years began to waver, and some even spoke of abandoning the siege and returning home. As the days passed and the Trojan successes mounted, the mood in the Greek camp grew increasingly desperate. Agamemnon himself began to realize the magnitude of his mistake. His pride had cost him the services of his best warrior, and now that pride was threatening to cost him the war itself. He sent envoys to Achilles, offering rich gifts and humble apologies, But the young hero's anger was too deep to be so easily appeased. The crisis deepened when Hector led a night attack that nearly reached the Greek ships themselves. Only the desperate courage of Ajax and a handful of other heroes prevented the Trojans from burning the fleet and ending the war in a single stroke. The Greeks were now fighting not for victory, but for survival. And even the bravest among them began to wonder if the gods had truly abandoned their cause. It was during this period of crisis that Patroclus, Achilles' dearest friend and companion, made a decision that would change the course of the war. Patroclus was a young man of noble birth who had been raised alongside Achilles and who loved him like a brother. He had shared all of Achilles' adventures and had stood by him through every trial, and now he could no longer bear to watch his friend's anger destroy both himself and the army he had sworn to protect. Patroclus had been present at every major battle of the war, fighting with skill and courage that had earned him the respect of heroes and common soldiers alike. He was not quite the equal of Achilles in terms of pure fighting ability, but he possessed something that was perhaps even more valuable, a gentle nature and a genuine concern for others that made him beloved by all who knew him. Where Achilles could be proud and quick to anger, Patroclus was patient and forgiving. Where Achilles thought first of his own honor, Patroclus thought of the welfare of his comrades. As the situation of the Greeks grew more desperate, Patroclus found himself torn between loyalty to his friend and concern for the army that was dying for lack of Achilles' help. He spent long hours walking on the beach, listening to the sound of distant battle and watching the smoke rise from the funeral pyres where the Greek dead were burned. Each day brought news of more casualties, more heroes fallen, more ships threatened by Trojan assault. Finally, Patroclus could bear it no longer. He came to Achilles in his tent, where his friend sat brooding over his wrongs like an eagle contemplating prey. The conversation that followed was gentle but intense, with Patroclus using all his skill at persuasion to try to move his friend's heart. He spoke of duty and honor, of the men who were dying, while the greatest warrior in the army sat idle. He reminded Achilles of their shared childhood, of the oaths they had sworn, and of the love they bore for each other. But Achilles' anger was too deep and his pride too wounded for even Patroclus to heal. He refused to return to battle, declaring that Agamemnon's insults had cut too deep to be forgiven. The war could continue without him, he said, and perhaps when enough Greeks had died, the survivors would appreciate his true worth. Seeing that direct persuasion would not work, Patroclus made a different proposal. If Achilles would not fight himself, would he at least lend his armor to his friend? The sight of Achilles' distinctive gear might be enough to rally the Greeks and terrify the Trojans, even if the man himself was not wearing it. And perhaps, with divine protection and the advantage of surprise, Patroclus could achieve enough to turn the tide of battle. Achilles was reluctant to agree even to this, for he knew the dangers that Patroclus would face. But his friend's pleading finally wore down his resistance, and he agreed to lend his armor on one condition. Patroclus must content himself with driving the Trojans back from the ships. He must not pursue them across the plain or attempt to storm the walls of Troy. The goal was to relieve the immediate pressure on the Greek camp, nothing more. As Patroclus donned Achilles' armor, he was transformed from a capable warrior into something that seemed almost divine. The bronze breastplate had been forged by Hephaestus himself, the god of metalworking, and it gleamed with an inner light that seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. The helmet was crowned with a crest of golden horsehair that had been a gift from the centaur Chiron, and the shield bore devices that told the story of Achilles' lineage and achievements. But it was the spear that completed the transformation. This was the great ash spear that had belonged to Achilles' father, Peleus, and which only Achilles among all the Greeks was strong enough to wield effectively. It was taller than a man and perfectly balanced, with a bronze point that could punch through any armor ever made. In Patroclus' hands, it became the symbol of heroic power incarnate. As Patroclus prepared to lead the Myrmidons into battle, Achilles offered a prayer to Zeus, asking the king of the gods to grant his friend success and to bring him safely home. But even as he prayed, Achilles felt a chill of foreboding, as if the fates themselves were whispering warnings that he was too proud to heed. The appearance of what seemed to be Achilles on the battlefield had an immediate and electric effect. The Greeks, who had been slowly giving ground before the Trojan advance, suddenly found new heart and began to fight with renewed fury. The Trojans, who had been pressing forward with confidence, hesitated as they saw the distinctive armor that they had learned to fear above all others. Patroclus led the Myrmidons forward like a force of nature unleashed. He fought with a skill and courage that surprised even those who knew him well, as if wearing Achilles' armor had somehow imbued him with a portion of his friend's divine strength. His spear work was magnificent, his shield work was flawless, and his voice rang out across the battlefield like a trumpet call to glory. The Trojans fell back before this unexpected assault, their ordered ranks dissolving into confusion as Patroclus carved a path through their lines. The young warrior seemed to be everywhere at once, rescuing isolated groups of Greeks, rallying broken formations, and striking terror into the hearts of his enemies. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as if the tide of war had turned decisively in favor of the Greeks. But Patroclus, intoxicated by success and perhaps influenced by the divine nature of the armor he wore, forgot the limits that Achilles had set for him. Instead of contenting himself with driving the Trojans back from the ships, he pursued them across the plain towards the walls of Troy itself. He was drunk on glory, eager to achieve something that would be remembered forever, and he pushed forward without regard for the dangers that lay ahead. As Patroclus approached the walls of Troy, the gods themselves began to take notice of the battle. Apollo, the god who had sent the plague to punish the Greeks and who favored the Trojan cause, saw that divine intervention was needed to prevent the city from falling. The god descended to the battlefield like a golden cloud, his presence terrible and beautiful at the same time. 3 times Patroclus attempted to scale the walls of Troy, and 3 times Apollo himself threw him back, the god's invisible hands striking him with force that no mortal could resist. On the 4th attempt, Apollo spoke directly to the young hero, his voice carrying the authority of immortal power. "Give way, Zeus-born Patroclus. It is not fated that proud Troy should fall beneath your spear, nor even beneath that of Achilles, who is far greater than you." But even this divine warning was not enough to turn Patroclus back. He was too far committed to his course, too deeply caught up in the momentum of battle, to heed even the voice of a god. He continued to press forward, fighting with a desperation born of the knowledge that he was running out of time, and that the opportunity for decisive victory was slipping away. It was then that Hector, greatest of the Trojan warriors, arrived on the scene. The Prince of Troy had been fighting in another part of the battlefield, but the crisis at the walls had drawn him back to defend his city. He came in his chariot like a storm wind, his bronze armor flashing in the afternoon sun, and his great spear eager for battle. The duel between Hector and Patroclus was one of the most tragic and magnificent encounters of the entire war. Both men fought with superhuman skill and courage, each knowing that the fate of the war might hang in the balance. Patroclus had the advantage of Achilles' divine armor, but Hector had the experience of years of warfare and the desperate strength that comes from defending one's home and family. The battle raged across the plain as the two heroes struck at each other with spear and sword, their bronze weapons ringing like bells with each impact. Around them, the fighting gradually ceased as warriors from both sides stopped to watch this epic confrontation. It was clear to everyone present that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and sung about for generations to come. But the outcome was determined by the intervention of Apollo, who had decided that the time had come for Patroclus to fall. As the two warriors circled each other like lions fighting over prey, the god struck Patroclus from behind with invisible force, stunning him and causing Achilles' helmet to fall from his head. The divine armor that had protected him so well suddenly felt heavy and cumbersome, and his spear broke in his hands at the crucial moment. Hector, seeing his opportunity, struck with the precision and power that had made him the terror of the battlefield. His bronze spear found the gap between breastplate and backplate, piercing Patroclus's body and bringing him down like a great tree felled by the woodsman's axe. As the young hero fell, his blood stained the dust of Troy, and the light began to fade from his eyes. With his dying breath, Patroclus spoke words that would haunt Hector for the rest of his brief life. "Death will come to you from Achilles, son of Peleus. You may glory now in having killed me, but your own doom draws near. The fates have spun your thread, and it will soon be cut by a greater hand than mine." Hector, even in his moment of triumph, felt a chill at these words. He knew that by killing Patroclus, he had signed his own death warrant. Achilles' rage would be terrible to behold, and there was no force on earth that could stand against it when it was fully aroused. But he had fought for Troy and for his family, and he regretted nothing. The death of Patroclus sent shockwaves through both armies. The Greeks, who had been rallied by what they thought was Achilles' return to battle, were devastated by the loss of one of their most beloved heroes. The Trojans, while celebrating Hector's victory, knew that they had awakened a sleeping dragon whose wrath would be terrible beyond imagining. The news of his friend's death reached Achilles as he sat in his tent, still brooding over his quarrel with Agamemnon. The messenger who brought the news was barely coherent, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver devastating information. At first, Achilles could not believe what he was hearing. Patroclus dead? It seemed impossible, unthinkable, a violation of the natural order of things. But as the truth sank in, Achilles' grief transformed into a rage so pure and terrible that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. He threw himself on the ground, tearing at his golden hair and covering his face with dust, his cries of anguish echoing across the camp like the howling of a wounded beast. The Myrmidons who had served under Patroclus wept openly, knowing that they had lost not just a leader, but a friend who had cared for them. Like a shepherd tends his flock. Thetis, feeling her son's agony from her palace beneath the waves, rose immediately to comfort him. She found Achilles surrounded by his men, all of them mourning the death of Patroclus, and her divine heart broke at the sight of her son's suffering. She took him in her arms, as she had when he was a child, but this time her comfort could not ease his pain. "My son," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow, "why do you weep? Has not everything happened as you wished? The Greeks have been driven back to their ships, and they have learned the cost of dishonoring you." But Achilles' response revealed how completely his priorities had changed. "What joy is there in that now?" he cried. "Patroclus is dead, my friend, whom I valued above all others, whom I loved as much as my own life. Hector has killed him and stripped him of the armor that I should never have lent to another. Now I care nothing for the quarrel with Agamemnon, nothing for honor or prizes or glory. I have only one desire left, to kill Hector and avenge my friend, even if it means my own death follows soon after." Thetis wept silver tears that fell like rain upon earth, for she knew that her son had just chosen the shorter path that the fates had offered him. If he returned to battle to avenge Patroclus, he would win immortal glory, but his life would be measured in days rather than years. She begged him to reconsider, to think of her grief and his father's sorrow. But Achilles' mind was made up. "Then I must die soon," he said, his voice steady despite his tears, "since I wasn't there to help my friend when death took him. Now I will go and find the killer of the man I loved, and I will accept whatever fate the gods have prepared for me." Seeing that her son could not be dissuaded, Thetis promised to bring him new armor to replace what had been lost with Patroclus. She would go to Hephaestus, the divine smith, and ask him to forge equipment worthy of the greatest warrior who had ever lived. Until then, Achilles must wait and not rush into battle unprepared. The night that followed was one of the longest in the history of the siege. Achilles sat by the walls of the Greek camp, staring out across the plain toward Troy, his heart burning with grief and rage. He could hear the sounds of celebration coming from the Trojan camp, where Hector was being honored for his victory, and each laugh and cheer was like a knife thrust into his heart. As dawn broke over the Aegean, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Thetis returned from the realm of the gods, carrying armor that surpassed anything that mortal craftsmen had ever made. The breastplate seemed to contain the light of stars, the helmet blazed like the sun at noon, and the shield bore images so lifelike that they seemed to move and breathe. The shield in particular was a masterwork beyond description. Hephaestus had wrought upon its surface a representation of the entire world, cities at peace and cities at war, farmers harvesting grain and shepherds tending flocks, dancers celebrating and mourners grieving. At the center was the earth itself, surrounded by the tireless sea, and around the rim ran the mighty stream of ocean that encircled all things. It was a work of such beauty and complexity that men would gaze upon it in wonder for as long as the world endured. As Achilles donned this divine armor, he was transformed from a grieving man into something that seemed almost godlike. The bronze seemed to mold itself to his body. The helmet settled upon his head as if it had been made for him alone, and the great spear felt perfectly balanced in his hand. When he looked upon himself in the polished surface of his shield, he saw reflected there the image of war incarnate. But before he could seek out Hector for their inevitable confrontation, there was one piece of business that had to be concluded. Achilles knew that he could not fight effectively while the quarrel with Agamemnon remained unresolved. The army needed to be united if it was to achieve the vengeance he sought, and his own honor required that he formally renounce his anger and return to his proper place as leader of the Myrmidons. The reconciliation scene between Achilles and Agamemnon was both moving and tragic. The king of Mycenae, his pride finally humbled by the disasters that had befallen the army, offered rich gifts and genuine apologies for his treatment of the young hero. He returned Briseis unharmed and added to her treasure and servants that would have made her richer than many queens. But Achilles, though he accepted the gifts and formally ended the quarrel, took no joy in this restoration of his honor. His heart was too full of grief for Patroclus to care about material possessions or royal apologies. He wanted only to arm himself and lead his men into battle, to find Hector and settle the debt of blood that lay between them. When Achilles finally emerged from the Greek camp in his divine armor, leading the Myrmidons in their first battle formation in months, the effect on both armies was electric. The Greeks, who had been demoralized by months of defeat, suddenly felt their courage return as they saw their greatest champions restored to them. The Trojans, who had grown confident in their recent successes, felt their hearts sink as they realized that they now faced an enemy whose rage would know no bounds. Achilles fought that day like a force of nature unleashed upon the world. His spear was everywhere at once, striking down Trojans with such speed and precision that his enemies seemed to fall like wheat before the reaper's scythe. His war cry echoed across the battlefield like thunder, and his bronze armor flashed in the sunlight like captured lightning. Men who had fought bravely for years fled before him in terror, and even the bravest veterans of Troy felt their courage waver when they looked upon his terrible beauty. The river Scamander, which flowed across the plain between the two armies, became choked with Trojan dead as Achilles drove his enemies before him. The young hero showed no mercy and accepted no surrender. His heart turned to iron by grief, and his mind focused on a single goal: finding Hector and making him pay for Patroclus's death. But Hector was not hiding from his fate. The Prince of Troy knew that his death was approaching, and he faced it with the courage that had made him beloved by his people. He spent what he knew might be his last evening with his wife Andromache and their infant son Astyanax, treasuring these final moments of peace and love before the storm broke over all their heads. The scene between Hector and his family was one of the most touching in the entire war. Andromache, one of the most beautiful and virtuous women in Troy, pleaded with her husband to avoid the battle that she knew would be his last. She reminded him of her own losses. Her father and brothers had all been killed by Achilles in previous battles, and begged him not to make their son an orphan and herself a widow. But Hector, though his heart was breaking, knew that he could not avoid his destiny. He was the defender of Troy, the hope of his people, and he could not hide behind the city walls while other men died in his place. He took his infant son in his arms, praying to the gods that the boy would grow up to be a better man than his father, and that he would live to defend Troy when Hector was gone. When baby Astyanax cried at the sight of his father's bronze helmet with its fearsome plume, Hector laughed and removed it, setting it aside so that his son could see his face. The moment was both joyful and heartbreaking, for everyone present knew that this might be the last time father and son would see each other. The helmet, lying on the ground, with its horsehair plume stirring in the breeze, seemed like a symbol of all the glory and terror of war. As dawn broke the next day, Hector armed himself with special care, choosing each piece of equipment as if it were a sacred ritual. His bronze armor had been passed down through generations of Trojan princes, and it bore the marks of many battles fought and won. His spear was perfectly balanced, his sword was sharp enough to cut silk, and his shield bore the image of the walls of Troy, the city he had sworn to defend with his life. The final battle between Hector and Achilles took place beneath the walls of Troy, where the entire population of the city had gathered to watch their champion face the greatest warrior of the Greeks. King Priam and Queen Hecuba stood on the highest tower, their faces etched with grief and pride as they watched their eldest son prepare to fight for his life and their city's survival. When the two warriors finally faced each other on the plain, the contrast between them was striking. Hector, though brave and skilled, was still a mortal man fighting for his family and city. Achilles, blazing in his divine armor and consumed by supernatural rage, seemed more like a god of war than a human being. His beauty was terrible to behold, his strength appeared limitless, and his speed was such that he seemed to flicker like flame. The duel that followed was epic in its scope and tragic in its outcome. Both men fought with every skill they possessed, their bronze weapons ringing like bells as they struck and parried, their feet raising clouds of dust as they circled each other like deadly dancers. For a time, it seemed as if Hector's experience and defensive skill might be enough to match Achilles' superior strength and speed. But the gods had already decided the outcome of this battle. Athena, disguised as one of Hector's brothers, deceived the Trojan prince into making a fatal mistake, while Apollo, who had protected Hector for so long, was forbidden by Zeus to intervene any further. Left to face Achilles' divine power with only mortal strength, Hector fought bravely, but was doomed from the start. The end came when Achilles, with superhuman skill and precision, found the one gap in Hector's armor, a small opening at the throat where the bronze plates met. His spear, driven by rage and grief and divine power, pierced through bronze and flesh and bone, bringing down the greatest defender Troy had ever known. As Hector lay dying in the dust, his blood staining the earth that he had fought so long to defend, he found the strength to speak one final prophecy. "I know you well," he whispered to Achilles, "and I can see your fate as clearly as my own. You will not live long to enjoy your victory. Your death waits for you at the Scaean gates, brought by Paris and Apollo." But Achilles, his heart still burning with grief and rage, showed no mercy even to a dying enemy. He stripped Hector's armor from his body, and then, in an act that horrified both armies, tied the corpse to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy. The sight of their greatest hero being dishonored in death sent waves of anguish through the Trojan people, their cries of grief rising like smoke towards the heavens. For 9 days, Achilles continued to abuse Hector's corpse, dragging it around Patroclus's funeral pyre and refusing to allow the Trojans to reclaim it for proper burial. It was an act that violated all the codes of civilized warfare, born from a grief so deep that it had temporarily driven the young hero mad. The gods themselves were offended by this treatment of a brave enemy, and they began to discuss intervention. It was then that one of the most moving scenes in the entire war took place. King Priam, the aged ruler of Troy, decided to go alone to the Greek camp and beg Achilles for the return of his son's body. It was an act of incredible courage for an old man to enter the camp of his enemies, trusting only in the laws of hospitality and the mercy of a grief-maddened warrior. Guided by Hermes, the messenger god, Priam made his way through the Greek lines under cover of darkness. He brought with him a fortune in gold and treasures, not as payment for his son's body, but as gifts to honor the warrior who had killed him. When he appeared in Achilles' tent, kneeling before the man who had destroyed his family and his city's hopes, the effect was profoundly moving. The old king's words were simple but powerful. He reminded Achilles of his own father, Peleus, who was even now waiting at home for a son who would never return. He spoke of the grief that all fathers feel when they lose their children, and of the respect that brave men owe to each other, even in death. He asked not for justice, but for mercy, not for forgiveness, but for compassion. Achilles, looking upon this broken old man who had risked everything to honor his son, felt his heart begin to thaw. In Priam's grief, he saw a reflection of his own pain and his father's future sorrow. The rage that had sustained him for so many days began to ebb, replaced by a deeper understanding of the cost of war and the bonds that unite all human beings in suffering. The young hero wept then, tears that he had not shed since the moment he learned of Patroclus's death. He wept for his friend, for his own approaching doom, for the old king kneeling before him, and for all the lives that had been lost in this terrible war. In that moment of shared grief, enemy became human to enemy, and the walls that hatred had built between them crumbled into dust. Achilles raised Priam to his feet and embraced him like a father, promising to return Hector's body and to grant a truce that would allow the Trojans to hold proper funeral rites. The two men, united in their sorrow, shared food and wine, and spoke of their lost loved ones until the stars grew pale with approaching dawn. The funeral of Hector was one of the most magnificent and sorrowful ceremonies ever witnessed. For 9 days the Trojans gathered wood for the pyre, and on the 10th day they bore their hero's body through the streets of Troy with all the honors due to a king. The entire city mourned, from the highest noble to the humblest slave, for they knew that with Hector's death their last great hope had been extinguished. Andromache, Hector's widow, led the mourning with a lament that moved even the gods to tears. She spoke of her husband's gentleness in peace and his courage in war, of the love they had shared and the future that had been stolen from them. She thought of their son, growing up without a father's guidance, and of the city that would fall without its greatest defender. As Hector's body burned on the pyre, sending smoke and sparks rising towards the stars, the Trojans knew that they were witnessing the end of an era. Their greatest hero was gone, their walls were weakening, and their enemies were stronger than ever. The war would continue, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Yet even in their grief, the Trojans did not despair entirely. New allies were on their way to support them, warriors from distant lands who had heard of their plight and who were willing to risk their lives for honor and glory. The war was not over yet, and there would be more heroes to fall and more battles to fight before the fate of Troy was finally sealed. The death of Hector marked a turning point in the war, but it didn't bring the immediate end that many had expected. Troy's walls still stood strong, her gates remained barred, and her people, though grieving, had not lost their will to resist. New champions would arise to take Hector's place, and the siege would continue with all its attendant suffering and glory. From the lands beyond the sunrise came Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, leading a band of warrior women whose skill in battle was legendary throughout the known world. These were not ordinary women, but daughters of Ares, the god of war, trained from childhood in the arts of combat and hardened by countless battles against men and monsters alike. Their arrival brought new hope to the defenders of Troy and fresh challenges to the Greeks who had grown confident in their recent victories. Penthesilea herself was a figure of almost divine beauty and power. Tall and graceful, with the fluid movements of a natural athlete, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of one who had never known defeat. Her armor was crafted from silver and steel, decorated with images of the moon and stars, and her weapons were works of art as much as tools of war. But it was her eyes that men remembered most, fierce and bright as those of an eagle, holding depths of courage and wisdom that spoke of a life spent in pursuit of honor and glory. The Amazon queen had come to Troy not for gold or conquest, but because she believed in the righteousness of the Trojan cause, and because her warrior's heart was stirred by the thought of facing the greatest heroes of Greece in battle. She had heard the songs about Achilles and Hector, about Ajax and Diomedes, and she longed to test her skill against such legendary opponents. When Penthesilea led her Amazons onto the field of battle, the effect was immediate and dramatic. These women fought with a ferocity and skill that astonished both armies, their battle cries ringing across the plain like the calls of hunting birds. They wielded spears and swords with deadly precision, rode their horses as if centaur-born, and showed no fear of death or defeat. For several days, the tide of battle swung back toward the Trojans as Penthesilea and her warriors carved through the Greek ranks like a scythe through grain. Greek heroes who had grown accustomed to easy victories found themselves struggling against enemies whose speed and skill matched their own. The camp followers and lesser warriors in particular fell before the Amazon assault like leaves before an autumn storm. But Achilles, though he admired the courage and skill of these new enemies, could not allow them to threaten the Greek cause. The young hero had been somewhat subdued since his reconciliation with Priam, as if Hector's death had satisfied some part of his rage while leaving him to confront the emptiness that lay beneath it. But when he saw his comrades falling before Amazon's spears, the warrior's fire rekindled in his heart. The duel between Achilles and Penthesilea was one of the most magnificent combats of the entire war. Both warriors were at the height of their powers, both fought with divine weapons and supernatural skill, and both were driven by a pure love of battle that transcended personal animosity. For a time, it seemed as if they were evenly matched, their weapons flashing like lightning as they struck and parried with incredible speed. Penthesilea fought with the fluid grace of a dancer and the deadly precision of a striking serpent. Her spear work was flawless, her footwork was poetry in motion, and her tactical instincts were those of a born general. She had studied Achilles' fighting style from watching his previous battles, and she adapted her own techniques to counter his strengths while exploiting his few weaknesses. But Achilles possessed advantages that no amount of skill could overcome. His divine armor protected him from blows that would have felled any mortal warrior. His strength was superhuman, and his speed was such that he seemed to exist in a different relationship with time itself. Most importantly, his grief for Patroclus had forged his rage into something harder and purer than any emotion Penthesilea had ever experienced. The end came suddenly, as it often does in battles between masters. Penthesilea, attempting a particularly daring attack, left herself exposed for just an instant, long enough for Achilles to drive his spear through her bronze breastplate and into her heart. As she fell from her horse, her helmet rolling away to reveal her face, Achilles felt a moment of profound sorrow at the waste of such beauty and courage. Some said that in that moment, as he looked upon her dying face, Achilles fell in love with the Amazon queen he had just killed. Whether this was true or merely the invention of poets, it was certain that her death affected him deeply. He had expected to feel the satisfaction of victory, but instead he felt only a great weariness and a longing for an end to all the killing. The death of Penthesilea sent waves of grief through the Trojan ranks, for they had placed great hopes in their new ally. But even as they mourned her passing, another champion was approaching Troy from the distant lands of Ethiopia. Memnon, son of the dawn goddess Eos, was leading an army of dark-skinned warriors whose weapons gleamed like gold and whose battle skills were legendary throughout the Eastern world. Memnon was a hero worthy to stand beside Hector and Achilles, a man of towering height and magnificent bearing, whose very presence on the battlefield inspired confidence in his allies and struck fear into his enemies. His armor had been forged by the gods themselves, his weapons were gifts from his divine mother, and his courage was such that he had never retreated from any battle or yielded to any enemy. The arrival of Memnon and his Ethiopians brought new hope to Troy at its darkest hour. These were not mercenaries fighting for gold, but warriors who had traveled across the world to defend what they saw as a just cause. Their loyalty to Priam was absolute, their devotion to their own prince was complete, and their determination to drive the Greeks back to their ships was unshakable. When Memnon took the field, leading his bronze-armed warriors in their first charge against the Greek lines, the sound was like thunder rolling across the heavens. His battle cry could be heard above the clash of weapons and the screaming of horses, and his spear seemed to find its mark with every throw. Greek veterans who had survived 9 years of warfare found themselves facing an enemy whose skill matched their own, and whose determination exceeded anything they had previously encountered. For days, the battle raged with unprecedented fury as Memnon carved a path of destruction through the Greek ranks. His Ethiopians fought with a discipline and coordination that spoke of years of training under their prince's leadership, and their exotic weapons and tactics confused and frustrated enemies who thought they had seen everything that war could offer. But inevitably, the two greatest heroes of their respective armies were drawn toward each other, like lodestones seeking iron. Achilles and Memnon met in single combat on the plain before Troy, while both armies drew back to watch what they knew would be a duel for the ages. These were not merely two warriors fighting for victory, but the embodiment of their culture's highest ideals of heroism and honor. The battle between Achilles and Memnon lasted for hours, ranging back and forth across the plain as each warrior sought the advantage that would bring victory. Both men were the sons of goddesses, both carried divine weapons, and both possessed skills honed by years of constant warfare. Their combat was less like a fight between mortals than like a clash between forces of nature. Memnon fought with the wisdom of the East and the patience of one who had learned his craft in battles against monsters and demons. His defensive skills were impeccable, his counterattacks were precisely timed, and his endurance seemed limitless. But Achilles possessed the fury of the West and the speed of one who had been trained by the wisest centaur in the world. His assault was relentless, his technique was flawless, and his determination was absolute. The end came when both warriors, exhausted by their long struggle, committed everything to a final exchange. Their spears met in midair, their shields crashed together like colliding mountains, and for a moment it seemed as if time itself had stopped. Then Achilles' divine strength proved decisive, and his spear found its way through Memnon's defenses to pierce the Ethiopian prince's heart. As Memnon fell, his divine mother Eos wept tears that fell as morning dew, and she begged Zeus to grant her son some honor in death. The king of the gods, moved by her grief, transformed Memnon's ashes into birds that would forever fight mock battles around his tomb, ensuring that his warlike spirit would never be completely extinguished. With the death of Memnon, the last great hope of Troy had been crushed. The city's allies were either dead or scattered. Her walls were beginning to show signs of wear after years of siege, and her people were growing weary of the constant warfare. But even in this darkest hour, the Trojans didn't surrender. They had defended their city for 10 years, and they would continue to defend it as long as breath remained in their bodies. It was at this moment of apparent Greek triumph that fate dealt Achilles the blow that had been prophesied from the beginning. Paris, the prince whose beauty had started the war and whose cowardice had often been mocked by both armies, stood upon the walls of Troy with his silver bow in his hands. He had never been considered a great warrior in the mold of his brother Hector, but he possessed one skill that made him deadly. He was the finest archer in Troy. As Achilles fought beneath the walls, pursuing the last remnants of Memnon's army, and showing the same ruthless efficiency that had marked all his battles, Paris drew his bow with careful aim. The arrow he nocked was not ordinary bronze, but had been blessed by Apollo himself, the god who had protected Troy from the beginning, and who had waited long for his revenge against the warrior who had defiled his temple and slaughtered his priests. The arrow flew straight and true, guided by divine will and mortal skill. It struck Achilles in the one place where he was vulnerable, his heel, the only part of his body that had not been dipped in the waters of the river Styx when his mother tried to make him immortal. The wound was small, but fatal, for the arrow carried not only bronze, but the curse of a god. Achilles felt the arrow strike, and immediately he knew that his doom had come upon him. The greatest warrior who had ever lived fell to his knees in the dust of Troy, his divine armor suddenly feeling too heavy to bear, and his magnificent strength flowing out of him like water from a broken vessel. Around him, the battle gradually ceased as both armies realized that they were witnessing the death of a legend. As his life ebbed away, Achilles thought not of glory or fame, but of the friends he was leaving behind and the home he would never see again. He thought of Patroclus, waiting for him in the halls of Hades, and of his father, Peleus, who would grow old without ever seeing his son return. He thought of all the men he had killed and all the grief he had caused, and he wondered if the immortal fame he had won was worth the price he had paid for it. The death of Achilles sent shockwaves through both armies, but it affected the Greeks more profoundly than anyone had expected. They had grown so accustomed to his presence, so dependent on his superhuman abilities, that they had forgotten he was mortal. Without him, the entire enterprise seemed to lose its meaning and purpose. If Achilles could die, if even the greatest hero who had ever lived could be brought low by a single arrow, what hope did ordinary men have? The funeral of Achilles was the most magnificent ceremony of the entire war. His body was burned on a pyre made from trees that had been sacred to the gods, and his ashes were mixed with those of Patroclus, uniting the two friends in death as they had been united in life. His divine armor was offered as a prize to the greatest of the surviving Greek heroes, and the competition for it nearly tore the army apart. In the end, the armor went to Odysseus, whose clever words and political skill won him the prize over Ajax, whose claim based on strength and courage seemed more obvious. The decision created a bitter rivalry that would have consequences long after the war ended. For Ajax never forgave what he saw as a betrayal by his own comrades. But even as the Greeks mourned their greatest champion, they knew that the war had to continue. Too much blood had been shed, too many heroes had died for the enterprise to be abandoned now. Troy still stood. Helen was still within its walls, and the oath that had brought them across the sea still bound them to their purpose. It was Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, who conceived the strategy that would finally bring Troy to its knees. The city's walls had proven impregnable to direct assault, and its defenders had shown that they could not be starved into submission. But perhaps, Odysseus suggested, they could be defeated by cunning rather than force, by stratagem rather than strength. The idea that came to him was both simple and audacious: to hide a small force of warriors inside the city itself, while making the Trojans believe that the Greeks had finally given up and sailed home. It would require a deception on a massive scale, a willingness to risk everything on a single throw of the dice, and perfect timing to ensure success. The centerpiece of Odysseus's plan was a massive wooden horse, ostensibly an offering to the gods to ensure safe passage home, but actually a hollow shell large enough to contain the greatest heroes of the Greek army. The horse would be left outside the gates of Troy while the main fleet sailed away, apparently admitting defeat after 10 years of fruitless siege. The construction of the horse was a masterwork of both craftsmanship and deception. Epeus, the finest carpenter in the Greek army, supervised the building with meticulous care, ensuring that every joint was perfect and every surface was smooth. The horse was made to appear magnificent enough to be a worthy offering to the gods, with a flowing mane carved from the finest wood and eyes that seemed almost alive. But hidden within the horse's belly was a hollow chamber, large enough to hold 30 of the greatest Greek warriors. Odysseus himself would lead this desperate band, along with Diomedes, Menelaus, and other heroes whose courage and skill were legendary. They would endure hours of cramped confinement, trusting their lives to the success of an unprecedented deception. As the horse neared completion, the Greeks began the elaborate charade that would sell their deception to the Trojans. The main army began breaking camp with obvious reluctance, loading their ships with the deliberate slowness of men who had been defeated. They left behind the debris of 10 years of warfare, broken weapons, worn-out equipment, and the graves of thousands of comrades who would never see home again. The fleet sailed away on the evening tide, their black hulls disappearing into the darkness, while the horse stood silent and apparently abandoned on the plain before Troy. But the ships had not gone far. They were hidden behind the nearby island of Tenedos, waiting for the signal that would bring them racing back to complete the victory. As dawn broke over Troy, revealing the empty Greek camp and the strange wooden horse standing alone on the plain, the Trojans could hardly believe their eyes. After 10 years of siege, their enemies had apparently given up and sailed away, leaving behind only this mysterious gift. The debate over what to do with the horse would determine the fate of the city and everyone within its walls. Some Trojans, led by the priest Laocoon, were immediately suspicious of the gift. "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," Laocoon warned, and he demonstrated his mistrust by hurling a spear at the horse's side. The spear struck the wood with a hollow sound that should have alerted everyone to the deception, but at that crucial moment, fate intervened to silence the warning voice. Two enormous serpents emerged from the sea, sent by the gods who had decreed Troy's destruction. The creatures attacked Laocoon and his 2 sons, crushing them in their coils and silencing forever the man who might have saved the city. The Trojans, interpreting this as divine punishment for defiling a sacred offering, decided that the horse must be brought within the walls. There was also the testimony of Sinon, a Greek who had been left behind as part of the deception. This man, carefully coached by Odysseus, spun a tale of being abandoned by his comrades as a sacrifice to ensure their safe journey home. He claimed that the horse was indeed an offering to Athena, built too large to fit through Troy's gates, so that the Trojans could not claim its protective power for themselves. The princess Cassandra, gifted with prophecy, but cursed never to be believed, ran through the streets, crying warnings about the doom that was hidden within the wooden gift. She spoke of fire and death, of the end of Troy and the scattering of its people. But her words fell on deaf ears. The curse that Apollo had laid upon her ensured that her true visions would be dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. Despite these warnings, the Trojans decided to bring the horse into their city. It was too large for the gates, so they broke down a section of the wall that had protected them for so many years. With ropes and rollers, hundreds of men hauled the massive wooden figure through the streets of Troy, while crowds cheered and children threw flowers in its path. As the horse was pulled through the city, the warriors hidden in its belly endured hours of terror and discomfort. They could hear the voices of their enemies just outside the thin wooden walls, could feel the motion as the horse was dragged over cobblestones and up the slope to the citadel. One false move, one sound at the wrong moment, and they would all be discovered and killed. The Trojans placed the horse in the center of their city, in the sacred precinct where it could receive proper honors as an offering to the gods. Around it they held a great celebration, drinking wine and singing songs of victory as they celebrated what they believed was the end of the war. After 10 years of constant vigilance, they finally allowed themselves to relax, secure in the knowledge that their enemies had sailed away and would never return. As night fell over Troy and the celebration gradually wound down, the city settled into the deepest sleep it had known in a decade. Guards dozed at their posts, gates were left unbarred, and weapons were put aside as the people of Troy finally allowed themselves to believe that the long nightmare of war was over. The wine had flowed freely during the celebration, and many of the defenders were too intoxicated to maintain proper vigilance, even if they had thought it necessary. Within the belly of the wooden horse, Odysseus and his companions waited through the longest hours of their lives. They could hear the sounds of celebration gradually fading, the voices growing quieter, the footsteps becoming less frequent. The air inside their wooden prison was stifling, and every muscle in their bodies ached from the cramped confinement. But they dared not move or speak for fear of discovery. As the city settled into sleep, Odysseus carefully opened the hidden panel in the horse's side and peered out into the moonlit square. The great wooden gift stood in the heart of Troy like a silent monument to Greek cunning, surrounded by the debris of the day's celebration. Garlands of flowers lay scattered on the stones, wine cups had been abandoned where they fell, and here and there a drunk Trojan slept peacefully in the shadows, completely unaware of the doom that was about to descend upon his city. One by one, the Greek heroes lowered themselves from the horse on ropes as silent as shadows. Their feet touched Trojan soil for the first time in 10 years, not as conquerors storming the walls, but as thieves in the night, about to repay a decade of hospitality with betrayal and death. Each man checked his weapons with practiced efficiency, their bronze swords and spears gleaming dully in the starlight. The first objective was the gates. Troy's massive portals, which had stood closed against the Greeks for so many years, had to be opened to admit the main army that was even now racing across the dark waters from Tenedos. Odysseus had studied the city's defenses during diplomatic missions in the early years of the war, and he led his men through the twisting streets with the confidence of one who knew exactly where he was going. The guards at the gates were easily overwhelmed. Some were asleep at their posts, while others were too surprised by the sudden appearance of armed Greeks to offer effective resistance. The massive bronze gates, which had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, swung open with a groaning of hinges that had not turned for a decade. The way was clear for the Greek army to enter Troy. Meanwhile, other teams of warriors were spreading through the city, setting fires and striking at key targets. The palace guard was surprised and scattered. The armory was seized to prevent organized resistance, and messengers were sent to signal the fleet that the city was ready to fall. The plan that Odysseus had conceived was unfolding with deadly precision. But even the best-laid plans cannot account for every contingency, and the fall of Troy was not to be accomplished without resistance. Aeneas, one of the greatest of the Trojan heroes, was awakened by the sound of fighting in the streets below his house. Looking out from his window, he saw the glow of fires beginning to spread through the city, and realized immediately that Troy had been betrayed. Aeneas was a man of exceptional courage and quick thinking, and he did not waste time on recriminations or despair. Gathering his household and such neighbors as he could rouse, he formed a small band of defenders and set out to do what damage they could to the invaders. If Troy was doomed, at least some of her sons would die fighting rather than be slaughtered like sheep. The fighting that erupted in the narrow streets of Troy was desperate and confused. In the darkness, it was often impossible to tell friend from enemy, and many Trojans fell to the weapons of their own comrades in the chaos. The Greeks, though they had achieved complete surprise, found that conquering a city was different from fighting a battle on the open plain. Every street corner could hide an ambush, every house could shelter archers, and every step forward was bought with blood. But the outcome was never really in doubt. The main Greek army had landed and was pouring through the open gates like a flood tide, bringing with them all the pent-up fury of 10 years of frustration. These were not men who had come to capture a city, but veterans who had watched too many of their comrades die to show mercy now. The sack of Troy, when it came, was terrible in its completeness. King Priam, awakened by the sounds of battle, donned his armor one last time and prepared to die as a king should die, with sword in hand, defending his people. Though he was old and his strength was not what it had once been, he was still a formidable warrior who had ruled Troy for decades through wisdom and courage. But as he emerged from his palace, he was met by Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles, who had come to Troy seeking to equal his father's reputation. The death of Priam was one of the most shocking moments in the fall of Troy. The old king, who had shown such dignity in his meeting with Achilles, was cut down without mercy by a warrior young enough to be his grandson. Neoptolemus, driven by a desire to avenge his father and prove his own worth, showed none of the magnanimity that had marked the previous generation of heroes. The age of honor was dying with the city that had nurtured it. Throughout Troy, similar scenes of tragedy were being enacted. Hecuba, the aged queen, watched her husband's death with eyes that had already seen too much sorrow. Her remaining sons were killed defending the palace. Her daughters were seized as prizes for Greek warriors, and her life's work of building and nurturing was consumed in the flames that now rose from every quarter of the city. The sack continued through the night and into the following day, as the Greeks systematically looted everything of value and put to death anyone who might pose a future threat. The treasures that had been accumulated over centuries, gold and silver, precious stones and works of art, fine weapons and beautiful textiles, were loaded onto ships to be divided among the victors. What could not be carried away was often destroyed out of simple spite. But not all of Troy's heroes died in the city's final hours. Aeneas, fighting a skillful retreat through the burning streets, managed to gather his aged father, Anchises, and his young son, Ascanius, and lead them to safety. This small band of survivors, guided by divine will and mortal courage, would eventually escape from the ruins of Troy to found a new city across the sea, a city that would one day grow to eclipse even Troy in power and glory. The escape of Aeneas was one of the few bright moments in the darkness of Troy's fall. The hero, carrying his crippled father on his shoulders while his son walked beside him, made his way through the burning city toward the secret passages that led to the harbor. Behind them, the flames rose higher and higher, consuming not just buildings, but the dreams and hopes of an entire civilization. As dawn broke over the ruins of Troy, the city that had stood for 1,000 years was no more. Where proud towers had reached toward the sky, only blackened stumps remained. Where busy markets had thrived, only ash and debris could be seen. The walls that had withstood every assault now stood broken and useless, their strength forever spent. The greatest city of the age had become a monument to the price of war. Helen, the woman whose beauty had started the conflict, was found in Paris's palace and restored to her husband Menelaus. The meeting between them was awkward and painful, for too much had happened for their relationship to be easily resumed. Menelaus had spent 10 years fighting to win her back, but now that he had her, he wasn't sure what to do with her. Helen herself seemed almost like a stranger, marked by years of exile and guilt. The The division of the spoils took several days as the Greek leaders argued over who deserved what share of Troy's treasure. Agamemnon, as overall commander, claimed the largest portion, but every hero who had participated in the final assault demanded his due. The captive women were distributed among the victors like any other prize, with little regard for their feelings or their former station in life. Cassandra, the prophetess whose warnings had gone unheeded, was awarded to Agamemnon as part of his share. The irony was bitter. The woman who had foreseen Troy's destruction was now to be carried off by the very man who had engineered it. But Cassandra's prophetic gifts had not left her, and she could see as clearly as ever the doom that awaited her captor when he returned home. As the Greek fleet prepared to depart from the ruins of Troy, carrying with them the spoils of victory and the survivors who would serve as slaves, the mood was not one of unalloyed triumph. Too many good men had died in the 10 years of fighting. Too much suffering had been caused for the victory to feel entirely sweet. The heroes who had dreamed of immortal glory found themselves confronted with the reality of what that glory had cost. The journey home would prove to be as perilous as the war itself. The gods, angered by the sacrilege committed during the sack of Troy, would scatter the Greek fleet across the wine-dark sea. Some heroes would never see their homes again, dying on foreign shores or disappearing into the depths of the ocean. Others would return to find their kingdoms changed beyond recognition, their wives remarried, and their children grown into strangers. Odysseus, the architect of Troy's destruction, would wander for 10 years before finally reaching Ithaca, his travels taking him to the very edges of the known world. His journey would become a legend in its own right, filled with monsters and magic, gods and mortals, temptation and trial. The man who had been so clever in war would need all his cunning just to survive the peace. Agamemnon, the mighty king of Mycenae, who had led the greatest expedition in history, would return home only to be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, who had never forgiven him for the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia. The curse that had followed the house of Atreus for generations would claim another victim, and the man who had conquered Troy would fall to a woman's vengeance. As the years passed and the immediate participants in the war grew old and died, the story of Troy began its transformation from history into legend. Bards and poets, wandering from city to city, would sing of the heroes who had fought beneath the walls of the great city, their voices keeping alive the memory of men who might otherwise have been forgotten. The names of Achilles and Hector, of Helen and Paris, of Odysseus and Agamemnon would become immortal in song and story. But it was not just the heroes who were remembered, the common soldiers who had fought and died, the women who had been widowed and enslaved, the children who had been orphaned and displaced. All of them became part of the great tapestry of memory that we call the Trojan War. Their individual stories might be lost, but their collective suffering and courage would never be entirely forgotten. The ruins of Troy itself would become a place of pilgrimage for later generations who would come to see the stones where such great deeds had been performed. Travelers would walk among the broken walls and try to imagine the city as it had been in its glory, when its towers had reached toward the sky and its gates had welcomed merchants from across the known world. Some would leave offerings for the heroes who had died there, honoring both Greeks and Trojans as men who had faced their fate with courage. In time, new cities would be built on the site, and new peoples would call the place home. But none would ever quite match the glory of the original Troy, the city that had stood against the greatest army ever assembled and had fallen only to treachery. The memory of that first Troy would haunt every subsequent settlement, a reminder of what had been lost when the flames consumed Priam's city. The story of the Trojan War would be told and retold for thousands of years, each generation finding in it something that spoke to their own condition. Sometimes it would be seen as a tale of heroic glory, celebrating the courage and skill of warriors who had lived when gods walked among men. Sometimes it would be viewed as a tragedy, mourning the waste and suffering that war inevitably brings. Sometimes it would be interpreted as a lesson about the dangers of pride and the price of beauty. But perhaps the deepest truth of the Trojan War lies not in any single interpretation, but in its very persistence in human memory. For 3,000 years, people have continued to tell this story, to find in it something that illuminates their own lives and struggles. The specific details may vary from telling to telling, but the essential themes remain constant: love and loss, courage and cowardice, loyalty and betrayal. The brief flowering of human excellence against the backdrop of inevitable mortality. The heroes of Troy, both Greek and Trojan, achieved what they most desired: immortal fame. Their names have outlasted the bronze weapons they carried, the cities they fought for, and the civilizations that celebrated their deeds. They have become part of the permanent heritage of humanity, examples of what mortals can accomplish when they strive for something greater than themselves, even knowing that their efforts may ultimately end in failure. And so, the story of Troy becomes, in the end, a story about story itself, about the power of narrative to preserve what would otherwise be lost to time, to give meaning to suffering, and to inspire future generations to their own acts of courage and sacrifice. The city may have fallen, the heroes may have died, but their story lives on, as immortal as they had dreamed of being, carried forward on the winds of memory and song. In the quiet hours of night, when the world seems most peaceful and distant from the clamor of war, we can still hear the echo of bronze on bronze, the thunder of chariots across the plain, the cries of heroes calling out their lineage as they rush toward glory or doom. The Trojan War may have ended 3 millennia ago, but in the realm of story and memory, it continues still, as fresh and immediate as the day the first ship sailed from Aulis toward the towers of Troy. The flames that consumed Troy have long since died to ash, scattered by countless winds across the plains of what we now call Turkey. The heroes who fought beneath its walls have returned to the dust from which all mortals come, and their very bones have crumbled into earth. The bronze weapons that flashed in the Anatolian sun have corroded beyond recognition, and the ships that carried armies across the wine-dark sea have rotted to fragments on forgotten shores. But in that strange realm where stories live and breathe with lives of their own, Troy still stands proud and beautiful, its walls still strong, its towers still reaching toward heaven. Achilles still races across the plain in his divine armor, swift-footed and terrible in his wrath. Hector still defends the gates of his city with courage that knows no equal. Helen still looks down from the walls, her beauty still capable of launching 1,000 ships and setting the world aflame. And perhaps that is the greatest victory of all, not the triumph of Greeks over Trojans or Trojans over Greeks, but the victory of the human imagination over time itself. For in our stories we defeat even death, and in our memory even the greatest tragedies become sources of beauty and meaning. The war may have ended, but the tale lives on. And in its living, it makes us all a little more heroic, a little more aware of the nobility that mortals can achieve when they reach for the stars. The siege lines have been abandoned, the camps have returned to grass and wildflowers, and the plain where heroes once fought has become the peaceful domain of shepherds and farmers. But on quiet nights, when the wind blows from the sea toward the inland hills, some say you can still hear the distant sound of bronze-shod hooves, the creak of leather, and the whisper of arrows in flight. The voices of men who lived and died for honor in an age when gods still walked among mortals. And now, as the flames of ancient Troy fade into the dusk of time, may your dreams be filled with peaceful shores and starlit skies. Rest well, knowing that somewhere in the realm of story and song, heroes still stride across the wine-dark plains of legend, their courage undiminished by the passing years, their glory undimmed by the shadow of mortality. Let their memory be your lullaby, and let their example of facing fate with dignity and courage comfort you as you drift into the gentle realm of sleep, where all stories eventually lead us home.